I had already put the money back into my pocket and turned toward the exit of the fair when I suddenly heard rough laughter and an angry shout from the edge of the square. I turned around and saw a man dragging a foal by a rope, literally dragging it because it could barely move its legs. The animal was so thin that its ribs stuck out through its dull, matted fur. Its head hung down weakly, and its thin legs bent with every step. The rope was tied to a butcher's cart, standing a little to the side. Several people stood around and laughed. Someone shouted after him, "Glue factory's the only place for him. He's good for nothing else." I stepped closer, and the foal suddenly lifted its head and looked at me. In that look there was nothing but tiredness and pain, but it was alive. That look had not given up yet. I asked the man, "How much?" He looked at me with a mocking smile and said he would take whatever I had in my pocket, because by morning there would be nothing left of the foal anyway. I stood there and looked at the money in my hand, everything I had until spring, because I had no other income except a small pension. Winter was just beginning, and I clearly understood what I was doing. But the foal looked at me again, and I silently handed over the money. On the way home, I almost carried the foal in my arms, trying to hold it so it would not feel pain. It did not resist or struggle. It simply leaned against me, breathing heavily, as if it no longer had the strength even for that. At home, I spread hay right in the entryway, laid it down, covered it with an old blanket, and got to work. Warm milk with honey, herbal infusions I had dried since summer, careful rubbing of its thin, frozen legs. At night, I woke up and came to check if it was breathing, and every time I heard it, I quietly breathed out in relief. On the third day, a veterinarian came from a nearby village. He examined the foal for a long time in silence, and the longer he looked, the darker his face became. Then he straightened up and said something that made my heart tighten. There were marks of beatings all over the body, both old and new. A broken rib that had healed badly. A burn on the left side, clearly done on purpose. Someone had not just neglected this animal. Someone had deliberately hurt it. The veterinarian shook his head and said honestly, "I don't know if it will live or not, Thomas, but if it does, it will only be because of you." I did not give up. Week after week passed, and the foal slowly, very slowly, began to change. First, it simply stopped trembling. Then, it started to lift its head when I came in. Then one morning I found it standing on its feet in the entryway, unsteady, with its legs spread wide, but standing. I named him Storm, because that is what something looks like when it has gone through something terrible and survived. Sam had been living with me for 4 years by then. I found him on the road during a snowstorm, very small, alone, without any documents. He sat by the roadside and said nothing. And in his eyes there was the same thing I later saw in Storm: tiredness and something alive that had not given up yet. No one ever came to take the boy, so he stayed with me. But it was when Storm appeared that I first saw Sam truly come alive. Every day after school, Sam would run into the entryway, sit next to the foal, and quietly talk to him, telling him about school, about the snow, about what he had seen on the way. And the foal listened, its ears raised. Maybe the boy's voice was the very reason why Storm eventually survived. By the end of autumn, Storm was already walking confidently around the yard. He had gained weight, and his coat had become smooth and dark. One morning I went outside and saw that he himself, without being called, walked across the whole yard to me and pressed his muzzle against my shoulder. I stood there and thought this moment alone was worth giving away those last savings at the fair. Sam stood nearby in silence, but I saw his face, the kind of face only children have when something important is happening right in front of them, and they can feel it. Winter came suddenly and harshly, as it does in the mountains. Snow fell in a single day and did not melt anymore. The roads were so covered that the nearby village could only be reached on horseback, and even then, not by every path. Around that same time, Sam fell ill. At first, it seemed like a simple cold, chills and fever, nothing serious. Marta, the wife of our neighbor Yakov, a kind and experienced woman, offered to help herself. She came every day, gave the boy herbal infusions, changed compresses, and watched his temperature. We thought we could manage on our own. But on the fourth day, it became clear that we could not. The fever did not go down. Sam began to struggle for breath, and Marta said something that made me feel cold inside. Without antibiotics, he would not make it, and we did not have them in our village. The nearest pharmacy was in a village beyond the pass. The roads were dead. Yakov had tried to get through by car earlier that day and got stuck after 200 meters. Marta looked at me, and we both understood that there was no one else. I looked at the snowstorm outside the window, put on my sheepskin coat, and went to the stable. 10 minutes later, I was already saddling Storm by the light of a lantern. The horse felt my worry. He shifted his feet and turned his head anxiously, but he did not step back. I patted his neck and quietly said, "We have to, my friend." Storm turned his head toward me and looked calmly into my eyes. We stepped out into the darkness. For the first half hour, the road could still be guessed under the snow. I knew every turn here by heart. I had traveled this way for 20 years. But then the storm grew stronger, and everything around turned into a solid white wall. The wind hit my face so hard that I could barely breathe. The snow blinded my eyes, and I understood less and less where I was. Storm walked steadily and confidently, and I held on to his calmness as the only solid point in the endless white chaos. At the pharmacy, no one opened for a long time. I banged on the door with my fist until a light appeared in the window, and a sleepy pharmacist looked out with an annoyed face. But when I told him about the sick boy, he understood without any extra words. I got the medicine, tucked it under my coat, close to my body, so it would not freeze, and we turned back. On the way back, the storm grew even stronger. I could barely feel my fingers. The cold went through me despite the coat, and my strength was fading with every minute. Storm kept moving. I held on in the saddle, and suddenly, the horse stopped sharply. I tried to push him forward, but he did not move. I tried again. He stood as if frozen, his ears tense, and turned forward into the darkness. Storm felt something. I understood it at once. He never stopped like this, without a reason. I looked ahead, and in the weak light of the lantern I saw something I had not noticed a second before. The snow there looked different, too smooth, too even. A cliff edge buried under the snow. One careless step forward, and we would have fallen into a deep abyss. I sat in the saddle and could not speak. Storm stood still, waiting. Then I simply loosened the reins and whispered, "Lead." And he led carefully, step by step, going around what I could not see and could not possibly see. We were almost back to the village when shapes appeared out of the darkness on both sides of the road. First one, then two more, then four at once. The wolves moved silently, without a single sound, closing the circle. I was unarmed, a lantern, a bridle, and the last of my strength. That was all I had. Storm felt them before I did. He stopped, and I felt his whole body tense under the saddle. But he did not rush forward or step back in panic. He slowly turned sideways toward the nearest wolf, lowered his head, and made a sound low, coming from deep in his chest, that I felt not with my ears, but with my whole body. Then he struck the frozen ground with his front hoof once, twice, 3 times. In that moment, I thought only one thing. This horse had trembled in spring at the touch of a stranger's hand. And now he stood without fear, and did not step back even once. The wolves stopped. The largest one, the one in front, froze and stared at Storm for a long time. The horse did not look away and did not move. He simply stood and waited. After a minute that felt like forever, the leader turned away and walked into the darkness. The others followed him. I did not move for a few more seconds. I just sat in the saddle and breathed, listening to the storm howling around me and to Storm breathing calmly and steadily beneath me. Then, we moved on. We reached home when the sky was just beginning to grow light. I got down from the saddle and realized that I could not walk. My legs would not hold me. I leaned against Storm's side and stood there for several minutes, just feeling his warmth and listening to his steady breathing. Then, I went into the house. Marta opened the door before I could knock. She had not slept all night. She had been sitting by Sam's bed and waiting. I took the medicine from under my coat and silently handed it to her. She looked at me, at my frost-bitten face, at my snow-covered coat, and said nothing. She simply took the medicine and quickly went to the boy. For several days I could hardly get up. The frostbite made itself known. My hands would not obey, and my temperature rose by that same evening. Marta had to nurse both of us, me and Sam, each with our own medicine. We recovered together, each in our own bed, while outside, the storm finally began to calm. When Sam was allowed to get up, the first thing he did was get dressed and go out into the yard straight to the stable. He hugged Storm around the neck as tightly as he could and did not let go for a long time. The horse stood still and let himself be hugged quietly, calmly, as if he had been waiting for this all along. A few days later, I was sitting by the window and looking at the yard. Storm stood by the fence in his usual place, and the morning sun made his dark coat look almost reddish. And suddenly, I saw something I had looked at every day but had never truly noticed. A white spot on his forehead, clear and even, in the shape of a star, and a reddish mark on his left shoulder where the sunlight fell directly on his coat. I froze and could hardly breathe. 22 years ago, in the hardest winter of my life, I sold a mare. I needed money, I had no other choice, and I sold her, and then I regretted it for so many years that I lost count. She had the exact same white spot on her forehead and the exact same reddish mark on her left shoulder. I went out into the yard. Storm turned his head and calmly watched me approach. I stopped beside him, ran my hand over his forehead, and found that familiar mark with my fingers. The horse closed his eyes and quietly exhaled. I will never know for sure, but sometimes life returns what you once lost, just in a different way and in a different form. That morning, I was grateful for every day that had led me to this moment, for the fair, for those last savings in my pocket, for the look of the foal that had not given up yet. And for a long time after, I kept thinking about how, on one ordinary day, I almost walked away from something that was never my business to care about.